The old dog started barking at the floorboards, seconds before the first gunshot echoed under the mountain. Smoke rolled through the antique shop as Caleb slammed the steel trapdoor shut with one hand and dragged his bleeding German shepherd across the floor with the other. Somewhere below them, metal footsteps kept climbing closer through the dark. The whole building smelled like ash, wet wood, and gunpowder, and Caleb suddenly realized his grandmother hadn't been hiding antiques down there. What do you think was hidden under the shop? The night the bank took Caleb Mercer's cabin, the snow came sideways across the Montana ridge. It did not fall soft or pretty. It came in hard white sheets, driven by a wind that hissed through the pines and slapped against the porch boards like handfuls of gravel. The sheriff's deputy kept his collar turned up and his hat pulled low, standing beside the county truck with his paperwork tucked under one arm. Two men from the bank moved through the cabin behind him, carrying boxes Caleb had already packed, because a man like Caleb Mercer did not wait for strangers to touch what little he had left. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps with an old green army duffel over his shoulder. 43 years old, former Army Ranger, Kandahar, 2010, Helmand, 2011. More places after that he did not name out loud anymore. His left leg had gone stiff in the cold, the nerve pain running from his hip to his ankle in a thin electric line. It always got worse when the temperature dropped. The VA doctor had called it residual damage from blast trauma. Caleb called it the weather, talking through old metal and scar tissue. Beside him stood Shadow. The German shepherd's coat was black and tan, thick around the neck, snow collecting along his back and melting into the darker fur. His ears were up, his body was still, not relaxed, still. There was a difference, and Caleb knew it the way he knew the sound of a magazine locking into place. The deputy cleared his throat. "Mr. Mercer," he said, not unkindly. "They're almost done inside." Caleb nodded once. He did not look at the cabin. Looking at it would not change anything. He had already walked through every room that morning. The bedroom, where he had not slept more than 3 hours at a time in years. The kitchen where the sink leaked unless you turned the handle just right. The wood stove he had rebuilt with scrap iron and patience. The back window that looked out toward the creek and the line of dark spruce beyond it. He had thought the cabin was far enough from the world. It had not been far enough from debt. Behind him, the heavy oak front door slammed shut. The sound cracked through the night. Caleb's body moved before his mind did. His shoulders dropped. His hand snapped toward his right side where a sidearm would have been years ago. His eyes cut left then right, catching the porch, the tree line, the headlights, the deputy's hand, the gap between the trucks, the upstairs window. Line of sight, cover, exit, contact. For half a second, the snowy driveway was not Montana. It was dust, heat, a narrow road outside Kandahar. A door blowing open too fast, static in his earpiece. Someone shouting, "Contact left," then Shadow pressed against his leg. Not hard, just enough. Caleb's fingers curled into the wet fabric of his coat, instead of reaching for a weapon that was not there. The deputy saw the movement. His eyes lowered, then looked away. One of the bank men stepped onto the porch carrying a cardboard box with Caleb's name written in black marker across the side. "That's the last of it," the man said. He was young, maybe 28, with clean boots and a red face from the cold. He looked irritated more than cruel, which somehow made it worse. Cruelty had shape. Irritation was just a man annoyed by another man's ruin. He came down the steps too fast. Shadow moved. The dog slid between Caleb and the bankman, shoulders forward, head low, ears flattening. Snow puffed under his paws as his weight shifted into a braced stance. The sound that came from his chest was not loud, but it was enough to stop the younger man mid-step. "Whoa," the man said, lifting both hands. "Control your dog." Caleb's voice came out low. "Easy. Stand down." Shadow did not look away from the man. Shadow. The dog held for one more breath, then backed up half a step, close enough that Caleb could feel the warmth of him through his jeans. The bankman swallowed and set the box in the snow instead of handing it over. "You've got until morning to clear anything else from the property," he muttered. "There isn't anything else," Caleb said. The deputy shifted on his boots. "You got somewhere to go tonight?" Caleb looked past him to the black ribbon of County Road disappearing between the trees. His pickup sat near the ditch, rust along the wheel wells, heater half working, gas needle below a quarter. In the cab were 2 blankets, a thermos with coffee gone cold, a map of Kentucky folded in the glove box for no reason he could explain, and a photograph of his grandmother tucked behind the visor. She had mailed it to him years before, back when he still answered letters. He adjusted the duffel on his shoulder. "I'll manage." The deputy held his gaze for a second, then nodded like he knew that sentence, and all the ways men used it to keep from saying they had nowhere to go. The trucks left first. Red taillights slid down the driveway, grew small between the pines, then vanished into the snow. The deputy stayed long enough to watch Caleb lift the last box into the bed of the pickup. Then he drove away too. When the sound of the engine faded, the ridge went quiet. Caleb stood in front of the cabin that no longer belonged to him. The windows were dark now. The front door had a new lock. His boot prints were already filling with snow. Shadow looked up at him. Caleb tried to say something. Nothing came. He walked to the driver's side, opened the door, and waited while Shadow jumped into the passenger seat. The dog turned once, settled upright, and faced forward like he had been briefed on the mission. Caleb climbed in after him. The truck took 3 tries to start. On the 4th, the engine caught with a coughing shudder. Caleb sat with both hands on the wheel, letting the heater spit cold air across his knuckles. His eyes kept moving. Rear view mirror, road ahead, tree line, left ditch, right shoulder. Old habits did not care that the war was over. The cabin disappeared behind him before the driveway met the road. He drove until the ridge dropped lower and the snow turned into wet sleet. The pain in his leg spread up his side. Twice he had to pull over because his fingers locked too tightly around the wheel. Shadow watched him each time, quiet and steady, amber eyes catching the dashboard light. Near 2 in the morning, Caleb found a diner on the edge of a highway town. The sign outside read Millie's All-Night Grill, though 2 letters had burned out, leaving it looking like Mill's All-Night Grill. A single neon coffee cup flickered in the window. The parking lot held 3 semis, a salt truck, and an old Buick with a cracked windshield. Caleb parked where he could see the road. He opened the passenger door, and Shadow stepped down into the slush. The dog stayed close as they crossed the lot. Inside, the diner smelled like burnt coffee, bacon grease, wet wool, and old heat trapped in cracked vinyl booths. A waitress in her 60s looked up from behind the counter. "No dogs unless he's service," she said. Caleb's hand went to the worn patch on Shadow's vest. It no longer had official markings, just faded stitching and an old strip of Velcro. "He is." The waitress looked at Caleb's face, then at the duffel bag, then at Shadow. "Back booth," she said. "Coffee?" "Yes, Mom." Caleb chose the booth in the far corner because it let him see the entrance, the kitchen door, the restrooms, and the front window without turning his head. He sat with his back against the wall. Shadow lay under the table, but not asleep. His body angled toward the door. The waitress brought coffee in a thick white mug. "You want food?" Caleb counted the bills in his wallet under the table. $12. 3 ones. A folded gas receipt. 1 VA appointment card he had missed 2 months ago. Just coffee. She studied him for half a second and walked away. 10 minutes later, she returned with 2 eggs, toast, and hash browns. "I said, just coffee," Caleb told her. "You did," she said. Kitchen made extra. There was no kindness in her voice. That made it easier to accept. Caleb ate slowly, giving Shadow small pieces of toast under the table. The dog took each one gently, careful not to touch Caleb's fingers with his teeth. Outside, the storm pressed against the windows. Inside, a television mounted above the counter played local news with the sound low. Caleb did not watch it. Flashing lights on screens had a way of becoming other lights if he stared too long. Headlights, tracers, fire, the burning white blink of a flare over a landing zone. He wrapped both hands around the coffee mug and stared at the steam instead. At 3:17, a trucker dropped a spoon. The sharp clatter against tile snapped across the diner. Caleb's knee hit the underside of the table. The mug tipped, coffee spilling over his hand. He did not make a sound, but Shadow rose instantly, pressing his head against Caleb's thigh. The trucker glanced back. "Sorry, man." Caleb nodded once. His burned hand did not feel like much, not compared to the way his heart was pounding against his ribs. By 4 a.m, the diner had thinned out. The waitress was refilling sugar containers. The cook had disappeared into the back. Snow drifted under the parking lot lights in slow white lines. Caleb had not decided where to go. He could drive south until the gas ran out. He could find a Walmart lot and sleep in the truck. He could call a shelter in Billings. If his phone had enough battery, he could do what he had done for years and turn every problem into the next small task. Stay warm, keep moving, feed the dog. Do not think too far ahead. The bell over the diner door rang. Shadow lifted his head. Caleb's eyes moved to the reflection in the window first, not the door. Older man, long dark overcoat, leather briefcase, gray hair under a brimmed hat, clean shoes wrong for the weather. Not local, not trucker, not law enforcement. The man stepped inside, paused on the mat, and looked around the diner as if he had been told exactly what he would find and still hoped he was wrong. His eyes landed on Caleb, then on Shadow. The man removed his hat. "Caleb Mercer?" he asked. Caleb did not answer right away. His right hand dropped below the table, not reaching for anything, just empty and ready. Shadow stood under the booth, silent. The man took one slow step closer and lifted his briefcase just enough for Caleb to see he was not carrying it like a weapon. "My name is Harold Bennett," he said. "I'm an attorney from Raven Creek, Kentucky. I've been trying to find you for 11 days. Caleb stared at him across the dim diner light. The waitress stopped moving behind the counter. Harold Bennett reached into his coat, carefully, with 2 fingers, and pulled out a brass key tied to a faded red tag. "Your grandmother left you something," he said, "and she was very clear that I was not to let anyone else get to it first." Caleb did not reach for the key. The diner seemed to shrink around the words. The old clock above the pie case clicked once. The waitress stopped with a sugar canister in her hand. Outside, the window, snow blew sideways under the parking lot light, turning the world beyond the glass into a white blur. "My grandmother's been dead for years," Caleb said. Harold Bennett lowered himself slowly into the opposite side of the booth, moving like a man who had learned not to startle wounded animals or veterans. He placed the brass key on the table between them, but not too close. "Your father's mother, yes," he said. "Evelyn Mercer passed in 2008. I'm speaking of your mother's mother, Ruth Callahan. Most folks in Raven Creek called her Grandma Ruth." Caleb's jaw tightened. He had not heard that name spoken in a long time. Ruth Callahan had sent birthday cards when he was a boy, each one with a $5 bill taped inside and handwriting that leaned to the right. She had smelled like peppermint, pipe tobacco from the old men who came into her store, and lemon furniture polish. Caleb remembered visiting her antique shop once when he was 9. He remembered narrow aisles full of clocks and lamps, old trunks, cracked leather chairs, and a German shepherd carved from dark wood that sat on the counter like a guard dog. After his mother died, family became a set of closed doors. His father moved him west. Calls stopped, letters came back less often. Then the army happened, and after that, Caleb learned how far a man could drift without noticing. "She died?" he asked. Harold's face changed, not dramatically, just enough for the answer to arrive before the words did. 6 weeks ago, he said. Stroke. She was 87. Caleb looked down at his coffee. It had gone black and still. He did not ask why no one told him. Men who had spent enough time alone learned that answers were sometimes worse than silence. Harold opened his briefcase and removed a thick folder bound with a black elastic strap. The folder was worn at the corners, but every page inside looked organized, tabbed, signed, notarized. A working man's order, not a rich man's display. She left a will, Harold said. Very specific, very difficult, very Ruth. The corner of Caleb's mouth almost moved. That sounds like her. She owned a commercial building at 114 Pike Street in Raven Creek, Kentucky. The ground floor is an antique shop, Callahan's Relics and Repair. The second floor has a small apartment. She left the building, the business name, the contents, and the attached rear lot to you. Caleb stared at him. The words had shape, but no weight yet. I don't understand. That makes two of us, Harold said. Ruth had nieces, cousins, church people, folks who saw her every week. She left them quilts, clocks, a few pieces of furniture, one very ugly ceramic rooster, but the building went to you. Caleb let out a short breath through his nose. I'm not exactly in a position to own anything. I gathered that. There was no judgment in it. Caleb studied him more closely. Harold Bennett was somewhere in his late 60s, maybe older. Tall, narrow shoulders, gray hair, clean shave, a scar along the left side of his chin that had not come from a razor. His hands were lawyer's hands now, but the knuckles were marked. He carried himself upright, chin level, eyes steady, not soft, not civilian soft. Caleb noticed the watch on his wrist next. Old military issue style, plain black face, scratched case. You serve? Caleb asked. Harold held his gaze for a second. Long time ago. Where? Different war. That was all he said, and somehow it was enough. Shadow shifted under the table, then stood. His nose moved toward Harold's briefcase, slow and deliberate. Not threatening, searching. The dog sniffed once, then sat back on his haunches and stared at the brass key. Harold noticed. So that's Shadow, he said. Caleb's hand tightened around the coffee mug. You know my dog's name? I know what Ruth wrote. He opened the folder and pulled out one page, sliding it across the table. Caleb did not touch it at first. He read it where it lay beneath the diner light. The dog stays with Caleb at all times. The sentence sat in the middle of a legal paragraph like something that did not belong there, plain and stubborn. Caleb looked up. What the hell is this? Harold folded his hands. That is the strangest instruction I have ever seen in a will, and I have handled estates where people left money to cats, old trucks, and once a retired carnival pony. Why would she write that? She said Shadow was the one who knows where to look. The waitress set the sugar canister down too hard behind the counter. Caleb barely heard it. Shadow's ears rose at the sound, then settled. Caleb leaned back against the booth. His eyes went to the door, then the front window, then Harold's hands, then the parking lot beyond him, the old scan, automatic. He could not stop it once his pulse started climbing. Ruth never met Shadow, Caleb said. No, Harold said. Not that I know of. Then how did she know about him? Harold reached into the folder again. This time he removed a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the cursive across the front was sharp and certain. Caleb Mercer, below it in smaller writing. Open only after the dog reacts. Caleb stared at it for a long time. The diner's heater kicked on with a dull, metallic groan. Warm air pushed through the vent near the floor and stirred the edge of the envelope. Shadow lowered his head until his nose nearly touched it, then gave one soft sound in his throat. Not a growl, not a whine. Recognition, if a dog could have such a thing. Harold did not miss it. That, he said quietly, is about as close to reacting as I'd care to see at 4 a.m. Caleb picked up the envelope. The paper felt brittle and real. Ruth's handwriting pulled something loose inside his chest. A small old thing he had not known was still there. He saw her hand guiding his over a broken pocket watch when he was a boy. Saw the bright blue veins under her skin. Heard her say, anything worth fixing makes a sound before it gives up, Caleb. You just have to listen close. He put the envelope into the inside pocket of his coat without opening it. Harold watched him, but did not object. You're not curious? I'm alive because I don't open unknown things in public. For the first time, Harold smiled. Fair enough. Caleb looked at the key again. What's the catch? There are back taxes. Not catastrophic, but not nothing. Utilities are off. Roof needs work. Raven Creek is not what it was. Coal left. Jobs left. Half the town is boarded up, and the other half is waiting to be. That's not a catch. That's America. Harold nodded once, as if the answer had landed somewhere deep. There's one more thing, he said. A company called Grayson Ridge Development has made repeated offers on the property for 3 years. Ruth refused everyone. After she died, they tried to approach the estate. She anticipated that, too. Harold slid another paper across the table. Caleb read the first line. No sale, transfer, lease, demolition agreement, mineral agreement, or right of access shall be granted to Wade Grayson, Grayson Ridge Development, or any affiliated entity. Specific, Caleb said. Very. Why? Harold's eyes flicked toward Shadow, then back to Caleb. Ruth told me if you came, you'd understand once you got there. Caleb gave a dry laugh with no humor in it. I don't have money for a motel, let alone a trip to Kentucky. Harold reached back into the briefcase and placed a small envelope on the table. This one was plain white. Inside, Caleb could see folded cash and a bus ticket sleeve. Before you say no, Harold said, this is not charity. Ruth left a small executor's travel allowance for the purpose of bringing you to Raven Creek. I am legally obligated to offer it. Caleb did not move. Pride was a strange thing when a man had just lost his house. It stayed standing even after everything else had been carried out in boxes. Shadow stepped closer under the table and rested his chin on Caleb's knee. The dog's fur was still damp from the snow. Warmth seeped through Caleb's jeans. Harold's voice softened. She waited for you, Mr. Mercer. Longer than most people would have. I don't know what is in that building. I don't know why the dog matters. I don't know why Ruth Callahan spent the last decade of her life making sure Wade Grayson never got near it. But I do know this. He tapped the brass key lightly with one finger. She believed the shop was not the gift. She believed it was the door. Caleb looked at the key. The red tag was faded almost pink now. Someone had written 114 Pike in black ink that had bled at the edges with age. He thought of the cabin door slamming shut, of the new lock, of the snow filling his boot prints, of the bankman dropping his box in the driveway like it had become inconvenient to hand a man the remains of his life. Then he thought of Ruth Callahan standing behind a counter full of old clocks, telling him to listen before something gave up. The waitress came by with the coffee pot. You boys need warming up? She asked. Harold covered his cup with his hand. Caleb looked at Shadow, then at the key. Raven Creek, he said. How far? By road. 30 hours if your truck survives it. My truck won't. Then we go as far as it will take us, Harold said. After that, we adapt. That word sat differently between them. Adapt. Caleb picked up the brass key. It was colder than he expected. Shadow rose immediately, tail low, ears forward, ready to move. Harold closed his briefcase. Outside, dawn had not come yet. The storm still owned the parking lot, but somewhere under the wind and the sleepless dark, Caleb felt the shape of a new mission forming, not hope. Hope was too bright a word. This was smaller, harder, a direction. He slid the key into his coat pocket beside Ruth's unopened letter. Then he stood, lifting the duffel onto his shoulder. Shadow moved to his left side without being told. As Caleb stepped toward the diner door, Harold Bennett spoke behind him. One more thing, Mr. Mercer? Caleb turned. The old lawyer's face had lost every trace of gentleness. When you get to Raven Creek, do not trust the first person who smiles at you. Shadow looked toward the dark window and gave one low growl. Out in the parking lot, across the road near the closed gas station, A black pickup sat idling with its headlights off. Caleb stopped halfway to the diner door. The truck was old enough that the body lines disappeared into shadow, but the engine vibration carried faintly through the storm. Snow drifted around the tires. No dome light, no movement inside. Watching. Harold Bennett noticed Caleb's posture change. "You know them?" the lawyer asked quietly. Caleb did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed on the truck, windshield angle, driver height, position relative to the road, easy exit route southbound. No visible plates from here. "Maybe nobody," Caleb said. But his hand had already tightened around the duffel strap. Shadow's ears pinned slightly forward. The dog did not bark again. That was what Caleb trusted most. Loud dogs scared easy, working dogs watched. The black pickup pulled away first. Slow. No tire spin. No hurry. It rolled past the diner without headlights, then disappeared into the curtain of snow beyond the interstate ramp. Only after it vanished did Caleb push open the diner door. Cold air hit his face hard enough to sting. By sunrise, the storm had weakened into gray sleet. Harold drove a dark blue Buick with cracked leather seats and enough miles on the odometer to qualify as historical. Caleb followed behind in his pickup for almost 4 hours before the transmission began slipping outside Sheridan. They stopped at a truck lot beside a frozen feed store. Caleb shut the engine off and sat listening to the ticking metal under the hood. "That bad?" Harold asked. Caleb tried the gear shift again. Nothing. "Yeah." The old lawyer studied the truck for a long moment, then nodded once, like a doctor confirming what the patient already knew. "You can tow it later. Can't afford later." Harold did not argue. By noon, Caleb had transferred everything he owned into the Buick's trunk. 1 duffel bag, a toolbox, a revolver wrapped in cloth, 2 blankets, a metal coffee tin filled with old army patches and photographs he had not looked at in years. Shadow jumped into the back seat without being told. When Caleb shut the passenger door and looked back at the truck one last time, the silence hit harder than losing the cabin. The pickup had carried him through 11 states after Afghanistan. Through jobs he quit, towns he forgot, nights sleeping beside logging roads because motel ceilings felt too close. Now it sat abandoned beneath a sky the color of dirty steel. Harold waited until Caleb got in before pulling onto the highway. They drove south for 2 days. Wyoming flattened into long frozen roads and cattle fences buried in snowdrifts. Then came Nebraska truck stops and endless dark fields. Missouri brought rain instead of snow. Kentucky arrived under low clouds and bare trees. Caleb slept in pieces, 20 minutes here, 30 there. Every time he drifted too deep, his body jerked awake before his mind did. Once, near St. Louis, a semi blew its air horn beside them. Caleb's hand snapped toward the dashboard, so fast Harold nearly swerved off the road. Shadow rose immediately from the back seat, paws braced between the front seats, pressing against Caleb's shoulder until his breathing slowed again. Harold kept both hands on the wheel. "Afghanistan?" he asked quietly. Caleb stared out the passenger window. "Among other places." The lawyer nodded like a man who understood that other places usually meant graves nobody talked about. By the time they crossed into the Appalachian foothills, the weather had turned colder again. The mountains appeared slowly through fog and pine, dark ridges folding into one another beneath a low winter sky. Small towns clung to the roadsides like leftovers from another century. Rusted gas stations, empty diners, churches with peeling white paint, trailer homes crouched beside frozen creeks. Harold finally spoke after nearly an hour of silence. Raven Creek used to have 12,000 people. Caleb looked ahead through the windshield. What happened? Coal stopped mattering to the people making money from it. The road narrowed as they climbed. Fog drifted across the blacktop in pale Abelsons. The trees grew thicker. Caleb noticed old mining roads cut into the hillsides, half reclaimed by brush. Then he saw the town. Raven Creek sat deep in a valley beneath the mountains, squeezed between pine-covered ridges and a narrow river running dark with winter runoff. Most of the buildings were brick from another era, stained black from decades of coal dust. Some storefronts were boarded over. Others leaned slightly like tired men refusing to fall. A rusted water tower stood above town, with Raven Creek painted across it in faded white letters. Shadow sat upright in the back seat now, watching, not relaxed, watching. Harold turned onto Pike Street. "This used to be the main commercial strip," he said. "Back before the mine closures." The Buick rolled past an old barber shop, a pawn store with bars over the windows, and a tavern called the Hollow Lantern, where 3 old men smoked beneath a sagging awning. One of them watched Caleb's car too carefully. Caleb noticed immediately. Gray beard, Carhartt jacket, burn scar on the left hand, eyes tracking the vehicle without moving his head. Military? Former miner? Could be either. Shadow gave a low sound in his throat. "I heard that," Harold muttered. "What?" "The dog." Caleb kept looking forward. "He doesn't like something. That makes 2 of us." Harold slowed beside a narrow brick building, squeezed between an abandoned pharmacy and a collapsed furniture store. Callahan's Relics and Repair. The gold paint on the window had faded almost completely away. The antique shop looked tired. 2 upstairs windows stared down at the street through layers of dust. One corner of the roof sagged slightly. Wind rattled an old metal sign hanging beside the door. But the building was standing, solid, older than the others around it somehow. Harold parked at the curb. For a long moment, Caleb stayed still inside the car. The place smelled faintly of wet brick, chimney smoke, and pine drifting down from the mountains. Somewhere nearby, a train horn echoed through the valley. Shadow moved first. The dog pushed toward the door before Caleb even reached for the handle. "Easy," Caleb muttered. But Shadow was already staring past the shop, toward the tree line behind it. The woods climbed steeply up the mountain beyond the rear alley, thick with pine and bare winter oak. Fog hung between the trunks like smoke. Shadow's ears rose. His body stiffened. Then he looked at the ground beside the building and began sniffing hard along the frozen edge of the foundation. Harold noticed it too. "That's the first time he's acted like that." Caleb nodded slowly. "Since Montana." Shadow moved around the side alley now, pulling slightly ahead. Snow and dead leaves crunched under his paws. Caleb followed him, past old trash bins and rusted pipes running along the brick wall. Halfway down the alley, Shadow stopped completely. He stood facing the rear foundation of the building. Still, listening, Caleb felt it then too. Not danger exactly, absence. Like the mountain behind the shop was holding its breath. The old ranger instincts crept in without permission. Caleb's eyes tracked the rooftops, drain pipes, rear windows, escape routes, the slope behind the property. He noticed boot prints in the mud near the back steps, partly washed by rain but recent enough to keep shape. Not Harold's, too large. Shadow lowered his nose to them and growled. Harold came up behind them slowly. "Problem?" Caleb crouched near the prints. "Maybe." The tracks led toward the woods behind the building. Not away from them, toward them. Caleb straightened slowly and looked uphill into the fog. The mountain gave nothing back. Then Shadow turned sharply toward the rear wall of the antique shop and stood motionless beside a section of old brick near the loading door. One paw lifted slightly, head tilted, like he was listening to something deep inside the building. Caleb stepped closer. Shadow. The dog did not move. Wind hissed through the alley. Somewhere inside the antique shop, something metallic gave a faint hollow knock. Shadow's ears snapped forward. Caleb raised one hand without thinking. "Stop. Hold." The old signal came back before words did. Shadow froze beside the rear wall, paws planted in wet leaves, nose pointed toward the brick, like the building had whispered his name. Harold Bennett stood 3 steps behind them, one hand inside his coat, not reaching for anything yet. "Old pipes?" Harold asked. "Maybe," Caleb said. He did not believe it. The knock came again. Soft, hollow, distant. Not from the rear door, not from the roof. Somewhere under the floor or behind the wall. The kind of sound metal made when temperature changed, or when something suspended deep in a structure shifted against stone. Caleb turned the brass key in his hand. "Front first," he said. They moved back through the alley slowly. Caleb kept Shadow at his left knee. He did not like putting his back to the woods, so he walked at an angle, eyes moving between the rear slope and the dark upstairs windows across the street. The front of Callahan's Relics and Repair faced Pike Street like an old soldier, trying not to show a limp. The display window was clouded with dust, but Caleb could make out shapes behind it. Lamps, chairs, a brass cash register, the tall shadow of a grandfather clock. A faded paper sign still hung crooked in the glass, closed due to illness. Back soon. Ruth had not come back. Caleb slid the key into the lock. It resisted at first, then turned with a heavy click that seemed too loud for the quiet street. The bell above the door gave one weak jingle as he pushed inside. The smell hit him first. Old wood, dry paper, lemon oil, dust. A little mildew near the baseboards. Beneath it all, something sharp and metallic that did not belong in a shop full of antiques. Shadow entered ahead of him, nose low, sweeping left to right. Caleb let him. The dog moved like he was clearing a room. Not rushed, not wandering. He checked the counter, the path between shelves, the base of a glass cabinet, then paused at the rear hallway. "Clear enough?" Harold asked from the doorway. "Nothing is clear enough," Caleb said. Inside, the shop was a maze. Ruth had collected pieces of lives other people had forgotten. Pocket watches, oil lamps, cast iron stoves, framed photographs of men in uniforms whose names were written on the backs and probably remembered by no one alive. A row of old radios sat on a shelf, each one with a cracked dial and a silent mouth. Caleb touched the edge of a wooden counter. Memory came quietly. 9 years old. His grandmother lifting him up so he could see the gears inside a broken clock. Her hands steady, her voice low. "Don't force old things, Caleb. They'll tell you where they're stuck if you give them time," Shadow barked once. Not loud, short, sharp. Caleb's body turned before his mind caught up. The dog stood at the mouth of the rear hallway, staring toward the back room. Caleb moved toward him, but before he reached the hall, headlights swept across the front window. A vehicle rolled to the curb outside. Harold stepped closer to the glass. "Damn," he muttered. A black Range Rover stopped in front of the shop, clean enough to look offensive on that street. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out wearing a charcoal overcoat, polished boots, and the kind of smile that arrived before warmth did. Mid-50s, thick gray hair, square jaw, confident posture. He did not look at the antiques through the window. He looked at the roofline, then the side alley, then the lot behind the building. Caleb noticed. The man opened the shop door without knocking. The bell gave another tired jingle. "Harold Bennett," the man said, spreading his hands like he was greeting an old friend at church. "I heard your car was back in town." Harold's face hardened. Wade Grayson turned his attention to Caleb. There was a flicker in his eyes when he saw Shadow. Quick, but there. Not surprise exactly. Calculation adjusting itself. "You must be Caleb Mercer," Wade said. "I'm Wade Grayson. Grayson Ridge Development. Your grandmother and I knew each other." Caleb said nothing. Wade smiled a little wider. "Fine woman. Stubborn as winter roots, but a fine woman." Shadow stood between Caleb and Wade without being told. His head was level. His tail was still. Wade glanced down. "That dog-friendly?" "No," Caleb said. Harold gave Caleb a side look. Wade's smile lost half an inch. "Well," Wade said, "I'll keep my hands where he can see them." He said it like a joke. Nobody laughed. Wade walked 2 steps into the shop and looked around with practiced disgust, disguised as concern. "Place hasn't changed," he said. "I told Ruth years ago this building was too much for one elderly woman. Bad wiring, roof rot, foundation problems. She never wanted to hear it." Caleb watched his eyes, not the shelves. Not the clocks, not the cabinets. Wade looked at the floor, then the back wall, then the hallway where Shadow had barked. "What do you want?" Caleb asked. "Straight to it." "I respect that." Wade reached into his coat and removed a folded document. "I'm here to make your life easier. You just got into town. You don't know Raven Creek. You don't know what this building costs in taxes, repairs, code issues. I do." He placed the paper on the counter. "I'm prepared to offer you $75,000 for the property, as is. Cash closing. I assume any county fees and structural liabilities. You walk away clean." The amount sat in the air. 3 days earlier, Caleb had counted $12 in a diner booth. Harold's eyes moved toward him, but he did not speak. Wade knew exactly what he was doing. Caleb picked up the paper. It was not an offer letter. It was a purchase agreement, already filled in except for his signature. "You carry these around for strangers?" Caleb asked. "For opportunities." "No." Wade blinked once. The smile returned, thinner. "You haven't even read it. I read enough. You're making an emotional decision." Caleb folded the paper carefully and slid it back across the counter. "I've made those before. This isn't one." The quiet changed. Outside, a coal truck groaned somewhere down the street. Inside, the old building ticked and settled around them. Wade leaned both hands on the counter. "Mr. Mercer, I don't know what Ruth told you in whatever dramatic letter she left, but this town is not kind to men who confuse inheritance with rescue. You're broke. You're new. You're carrying a war behind your eyes, and everybody on this street can see it." Shadow's lips lifted just enough to show white teeth. Caleb's voice stayed flat. "Step back from the counter." Wade looked at the dog, then at Caleb. Slowly, he straightened. "I'm trying to help you." "No," Caleb said. "You're trying to hurry me." That landed. For the first time, Wade's face showed something real. Annoyance. He buttoned his coat. "Fine, take a few days. Walk around. Smell the dust. Pretend this place is a second chance." He glanced toward the rear hallway again. "But that basement's probably unstable anyway. Wouldn't want you falling through some old floor and getting hurt." Harold went very still. Caleb did too. Basement. He had not mentioned a basement. Harold had not mentioned a basement. The shop had not been inspected yet. The rear knock still hung in Caleb's memory like a warning. Wade seemed to realize he had said too much. His smile came back too fast. "Old buildings," he said lightly. "You know how they are." Caleb stepped closer. "How do you?" Wade's eyes cooled. "Because I know every building on Pike Street." Shadow growled again, deeper this time. Wade looked down at him. "Control your animal, Ranger." Caleb felt the word hit like a finger pressed into an old wound. Not veteran, not Mr. Mercer, Ranger. He had been briefed. Caleb's thumb brushed the seam of his coat pocket where Ruth's unopened envelope rested. He forced his breathing down through his nose. 4 count in, hold, out slow. "No sale," Caleb said. Wade's jaw flexed once. "Then I suggest you get a good contractor and a better lawyer." Harold smiled without warmth. "He has one." Wade looked at him for a long second, then turned and walked to the door. Before leaving, he paused and glanced back at Caleb. Ruth should have let dead things stay dead. The bell jingled after him. Outside, Wade climbed into the Range Rover. He did not drive off immediately. He sat there, phone pressed to his ear, eyes on the shop window. Caleb moved to the edge of the display case and watched him through a gap in the dust. Shadow stood beside his boot, body angled toward the rear of the building again. Harold exhaled slowly. "He knew about the basement," Caleb said. Harold did not answer. That was answer enough. Caleb stepped outside only after Wade's vehicle disappeared down Pike Street. He walked to the curb, crouched, and looked at the wet pavement where the Range Rover had been parked. Mud had fallen from the tires in thick clumps, not street mud, clay, yellow-brown, with pine needles stuck in it, the same kind of clay from the slope behind the shop. Caleb stood and scanned the street. Across from the tavern, the gray-bearded man with the burned left hand looked away too late. Caleb made a note of him without writing it down. Back inside, Shadow was no longer near the front. He had gone down the rear hallway. Caleb followed. The hallway led to a storage room, packed with old wardrobes, steamer trunks, rolled carpets, and broken chairs stacked against the walls. A single dirty window looked out toward the woods. Shadow stood at the back door, staring at the knob. His hackles were raised. Caleb came closer and saw it. Fresh marks around the lock, thin, bright scratches cut into old brass. Someone had tried to get in recently. He crouched, touched the metal, then looked at the floor below. A few damp flakes of mud had dried near the threshold. Caleb reached down and lifted one between two fingers. Yellow-brown clay, pine needles. Behind him, deep within the shop, the same hollow metallic knock sounded once more. This time, Shadow turned toward the storage room floor and began to growl at the boards beneath Caleb's feet. The sound stayed low in the dog's chest, steady and controlled. Not fear, not confusion. A warning held on a leash. Caleb looked down. The floorboards were old pine, scuffed gray from decades of use. Dust had settled thick between them. Nothing moved, nothing showed, but Shadow kept his nose pointed at one spot near the back corner, just beyond a heavy wardrobe with a cracked mirror leaning against it. Harold stepped into the doorway behind Caleb. "What is he doing?" "Listening," Caleb said. "To what?" Caleb didn't answer. He crouched and laid his palm flat on the floor. Cold came up through the boards. Not the ordinary cold of an unheated building. Deeper than that, dry, clean, almost like air moving from somewhere below. Shadow scratched once at the wood. Caleb caught his collar gently. Not yet. The dog stopped at once, but his eyes never left the floor. Harold looked from the dog to the scratched rear lock, then back toward the front of the shop. "I should call someone about the attempted entry." "No," Harold frowned. "Caleb, no police yet." "Why?" Caleb stood slowly, joints stiff from the cold and the long drive. "Because whoever tried that lock knew where to come. Wade knew about a basement. Somebody watched us before we left Montana. And if this town is as small as you say, a police call might travel faster than we do." Harold's mouth closed. He did not like it, but he understood it. Caleb walked through the shop again. Slower this time. He checked the front lock, the windows, the side alley, the upstairs stairs. The old revolver stayed tucked in the back of his waistband, hidden beneath his coat, but his hand never rested on it. He did not want to think like that. He just did. Shadow followed close. The second-floor apartment sat above the shop like a room forgotten by time. A narrow staircase led up to a small landing. The apartment had a living room, a bedroom, a kitchen with yellowed linoleum and windows looking over Pike Street. Ruth's chair still sat by the front window. A folded quilt lay across one arm. Beside it was a small table with a lamp, a magnifying glass, and a coffee cup washed clean and turned upside down. Caleb stood in the doorway for a moment. The place did not feel abandoned. It felt paused. Harold came up behind him, breathing a little heavier from the stairs. "She stayed up here until the last week," he said. "Wouldn't go to assisted living. Said she had a promise to keep." Caleb looked at the chair. "To who?" Harold did not answer right away. "Maybe you." Caleb stepped into the kitchen and turned the faucet. "Nothing. Water's off," Harold said. "Electric too, mostly. I had the county leave basic service on downstairs long enough for inspection access. But the apartment is cold." Caleb opened the cabinet under the sink. Empty except for a dead mousetrap and an old coffee can full of screws. "I've slept in worse." Harold watched him in the dim light. "I know." The words were too quiet to argue with. That afternoon, Harold drove to the county office to start utility transfers and gather tax records. Caleb stayed behind with Shadow. He told himself it was to secure the building. It was partly true. The rest was that he needed to be alone in the place before it became real. He opened windows that would still move, swept glass and mouse droppings from the back room, found an old breaker panel near the rear hallway, and traced labels written in Ruth's careful hand. "Front lights, counter, Office, back room, upstairs, workshop. One switch was taped over with yellowed electrical tape. Do not flip. Caleb stared at it. Shadow sat beside him watching. Yeah, Caleb muttered. I see it. He left the switch alone. The light in the shop faded early, swallowed by the mountains. By 5 o'clock, Pike Street had gone the color of wet ash. A few trucks passed. None slowed. The hollow lantern's sign buzzed on across the street, red neon bleeding into the mist. Caleb found a dented toolbox under the counter and an old work light with a cracked plastic cage. He plugged it into the one working outlet near the front desk. It flickered, dimmed, then held. The shop filled with weak amber light. He started repairing what he could. Routine helped. Wire, screwdriver, tape, test, move. His hands remembered work better than his mind remembered rest. In the storage room, he replaced a cracked outlet cover. In the hallway, he reset a loose fixture. Near the front counter, he climbed a step stool to inspect a hanging lamp shaped like a brass lantern. The cord was frayed where it entered the ceiling. Shadow lay near the foot of the stool, head on his paws, eyes half closed but not asleep. Caleb reached up with the screwdriver. The old bulb popped, not loud, just a sharp white burst. Glass snapped. The fixture sparked. Light flashed across Caleb's face. The shop vanished. Dust became sand. The cold became heat. The amber work light became the white blink of an explosion on a road outside Kandahar. Caleb hit the floor before the broken glass finished falling. His shoulder struck the boards hard. His elbow slammed into the counter. He rolled toward cover that wasn't there. Chest tight, mouth open, but no air coming in. Radio static filled his skull. Man down. Man down. Someone screaming for Doc, burning rubber. A door blown off a convoy truck. The taste of copper. A young soldier named Ellis trying to speak with half a word left in him. Caleb's hands clawed against the floorboards. Not here. Not here. But his body did not believe him. Shadow was on him in an instant. The dog did not bark, did not lick his face, did not panic. He forced his body into Caleb's side, heavy and warm, pressing across Caleb's ribs the way he had been trained to ground a man before the fall went too far. His muzzle pushed under Caleb's chin. His breath came steady against Caleb's neck. Caleb's fingers found fur thick, real, alive. Shadow, he rasped. The dog pushed harder. Caleb dragged in one breath, then another. The shop returned in pieces, the counter, the broken bulb, the old clocks, the smell of dust, the wind moving against the front window. Not Kandahar. Kentucky. Not contact. Glass. Just glass. He lay there for a long minute with one hand buried in Shadow's ruff and the other flat against the floor, feeling the boards beneath his palm. Something below gave the faintest answering vibration. Caleb turned his head slowly toward the storage room. Shadow felt it too. The dog lifted his head and looked that way. Caleb sat up with effort. A shard of glass had nicked his cheek. He wiped it with the back of his hand and saw a thin red line across his knuckles. The old shame came next. Always did. Not the fear. Not the flash. The shame after. The knowledge that a light bulb could still put him on the floor years after he had come home. Shadow leaned into him again. Caleb let out a breath that nearly became a laugh and nearly became something else. "I'm tired, buddy," he whispered. The words fell into the dusty shop and stayed there. Shadow's tail moved once against the floor. That night, Caleb dragged an old mattress from the apartment bedroom down to the storage room. He did not know why he chose that room, except Shadow refused to leave it. The dog circled twice near the back wall, checked the rear door, then lay across the threshold, facing the hallway like a sentry posted for the dark hours. Caleb kept the revolver on the floor beside the mattress. He did not sleep. The old building breathed around him. Pipes ticked, wind pressed against the bricks. Somewhere in the walls, a mouse scratched once and went still. Pike Street quieted after midnight until the town seemed emptied out and dropped at the bottom of the mountain. At 2:13 a.m., a metallic bang snapped through the rear of the shop. Caleb was upright before he knew he had moved. Revolver in hand, Shadow was already standing. The sound came again. Not from below this time, from the back door. Caleb moved without turning on the light, bare feet on cold boards, weight along the outside edges, slow, quiet, Shadow at his knee, body low. At the storage room entrance, Caleb paused and listened. Nothing, then the faint scrape of metal against metal. Someone working the lock. Caleb pointed 2 fingers toward the floor. Shadow dropped silently. Caleb moved to the side of the door, not in front of it. Old habit. Never stand where the bullet or blade expects you. The scraping stopped. A shadow crossed the bottom crack beneath the door. Caleb raised the revolver, not high, not dramatic, just ready. Then Shadow's head turned sharply. Not to the door, to the floor behind Caleb. The boards under the heavy wardrobe gave a faint, hollow knock. The person outside froze. For one breath, everyone listened. Then boots scraped on the back step. Running. Caleb yanked the door open, cold air rushing in. Shadow surged forward, but stopped on Caleb's command. Hold. The alley was empty. A dark figure disappeared into the trees beyond the rear lot, moving fast up the slope. Too fast for an old drunk, too sure-footed for a random thief. Caleb stepped onto the back threshold and scanned the ground. Fresh scratches scarred the lock, this time deeper. Beside them, pressed into the wet mud, was a clear boot print. Same tread as before, but now there was something else. A smear of dark grease on the doorframe. Caleb touched it with 2 fingers and smelled it. Machine oil, not from the shop, not from a crowbar, weapon oil. Behind him, Shadow moved back into the storage room and stood over the boards near the wardrobe. He looked at Caleb, then scratched once, not frantic, precise, as if telling him the same thing Ruth had tried to say from the grave. Listen here. Caleb closed the rear door and slid the bolt. Then he turned toward the wardrobe. Outside, somewhere in the trees, an engine started without headlights. The sound was low at first, hidden under the wind moving through the alley. Then it faded uphill, away from Pike Street, into the dark woods behind the shop. Caleb stood still until it was gone. Shadow stayed over the floorboards, watching him. The old wardrobe loomed against the back wall, tall and heavy, its cracked mirror silvered black at the edges. Dust lay thick across the top. Someone had pushed it there long ago and left it like a barricade. Caleb looked at the boards beneath it, then at the rear door, then at Shadow. Clear the room first, he said quietly. The dog did not move until Caleb gave the hand signal. They worked the shop from back to front. Caleb moved through the storage room, with the revolver lowered along his thigh, muzzle pointed at the floor. He checked behind the rolled carpets under the desk inside the old coat closet, then moved to the hallway. Each doorway got the same treatment. Pause. Listen. Angle clear. Shadow moved ahead when allowed. Nose low, body silent. The shop gave up only dust and old furniture. No intruder, no open window, no second set of footsteps inside. When they reached the front door, Caleb looked through the grimy glass at Pike Street. The tavern sign across the road still glowed red. A pickup rolled past slowly, but did not stop. The streetlights flickered in the mist. He locked the front, then returned to the storage room. The wardrobe waited. Caleb dragged the old work light closer and plugged it in. Amber light pooled across the floor, catching dust in the air. Shadow sat 5 feet back, ears forward, as if he knew this part had to be careful. The wardrobe was heavier than it looked. Caleb braced his shoulder against it and pushed. Pain shot down his left leg. He stopped, jaw tight, breathing through his nose until the nerve fire settled. Then he shifted his weight and pushed again, using his right leg, back straight, hands flat against the old oak. The wardrobe groaned across the boards. 1 inch, then another. Dust broke loose in gray sheets. Behind it, the wall was bare brick, but the floor beneath was wrong. Caleb crouched. The boards under the wardrobe were shorter than the rest, cut into a square. The edges had been sanded smooth, then darkened with age, until they almost disappeared. In the center was a recessed iron ring, painted over so many times it looked like part of the wood grain. Shadow stood. A thin sound came from his throat. Caleb touched the ring. Cold iron. The kind of cold that had not warmed with the room. He reached into his coat and pulled out Ruth's envelope, the one Harold had given him in the diner. Open only after the dog reacts. His fingers paused on the seal. For a moment the storage room seemed to fall away. He saw Ruth as he had seen her when he was 9, standing behind a counter with a screwdriver tucked behind one ear, her eyes bright and sharp, saying old things only told their secrets to people who stayed patient. Caleb broke the seal. The paper inside was folded once. Her handwriting filled less than half the page. Caleb, if Shadow found the door, trust what your grandfather died protecting. Do not call the county. Do not trust Grayson. Do not let anyone take the shop before you see what is underneath it. Your father was not told the truth, and neither were you. The code, if the inner door still holds, is the date your father came home from Vietnam. Harold knows the year. Shadow will know the way. I am sorry I could not tell you sooner. Some promises are heavier than love. Grandma Ruth. Caleb read it twice. The room did not move, but something inside him did. Your father was not told the truth, and neither were you. His father, Daniel Mercer, had been a hard man in quiet ways, a Vietnam veteran who never raised his voice unless a door slammed too fast. He had died when Caleb was 22, 3 months before Caleb shipped out. Hunting accident, they had said. Tripped on wet rock, rifle discharged, alone in the hills. Caleb had believed it because grief had not left room for questions. Now, his dead grandmother had reached across time and placed a question in his hands. Shadow stepped closer and nudged the iron ring with his nose. Caleb folded the letter and placed it inside his shirt pocket. Yeah, he whispered. I see it. He wrapped both hands around the ring and pulled. Nothing. The trapdoor held like it had grown roots. He found a crowbar near the back exit, slid the flat end into the seam, and leaned down slowly. The first crack sounded like a branch breaking in the cold. Rust gave way in flakes. The wood lifted half an inch, then dropped. Caleb repositioned the bar. Again, the old shoulder injury from Afghanistan flared. His left leg trembled under him. Sweat gathered at the back of his neck despite the cold. Shadow stood close but out of the way, watching every movement like a partner waiting for his turn. On the fourth pull, the trapdoor opened. Air rose from below. Not damp cellar air, dry cold, stale in a sealed way like a storage case opened after decades. The work light reached only the first few steps. Concrete stairs descended beneath the shop, narrow and steep, disappearing into black. Caleb stared down. His pulse slowed, which was never a good sign. His body knew this mode too well. Fear burned off, sound sharpened, the room became angles and distances. Stairwell, unknown depth, limited visibility. One entry, no confirmed exit, unclear. He took the flashlight from his duffel, checked the batteries, then checked the revolver. Old routine, not dramatic, just done. Shadow waited at the edge of the opening. No, Caleb said. The dog looked at him. Not first. Shadow did not step back. Caleb almost smiled. Fine. Together. Before he took the first step, he listened. The building creaked overhead. Wind pressed the rear door. Somewhere across the street, a truck downshifted. But below the stairs there was another sound. Faint, metal ticking against metal, like something cooling or waking. Caleb descended 3 steps. Concrete replaced wood under his boots. The temperature dropped quickly. The walls were not stone or brick, but poured concrete. Smooth, thick, not part of an old antique shop foundation. This had been built by someone with money, equipment, and a reason to hide what they were doing. At the bottom of the stairs, his flashlight beam struck a steel door. Not rusty, not old in the way the shop was old. Heavy, flat, gray, with a mechanical keypad mounted beside it under a dust-covered protective cover. Caleb stopped. Shadow came down behind him, slow and careful, nails clicking softly against concrete. The dog sniffed the air once, then stared past the steel door. Caleb touched the keypad cover. It moved freely, still intact. He went back upstairs and called Harold from the landline behind the counter, the only phone in the building that still had a dial tone after he had jiggled the cord until static became signal. Harold answered on the second ring. "Bennett, I found the door." There was silence, then Harold exhaled once. "Is the dog with you?" "Yes." "Good. Ruth said you know the date my father came home from Vietnam." Harold did not answer immediately. Caleb heard paper moving on the other end, a drawer opening, the faint metallic slide of a file cabinet. Then Harold said, "May 14th, 1971. Caleb wrote it on a receipt with a dull pencil. "Why do you know that?" "Because your grandmother made me memorize it 20 years ago." Caleb closed his eyes for half a second. "What's behind the steel door, Harold?" The old lawyer's voice came back lower. "I was hoping I'd die before you asked me that." The line crackled. Then Harold said, "Do not open it until I get there." A sound came from below the floor. Not a knock this time, a long, heavy shift of metal. Shadow barked once from the stairwell. Caleb turned toward the open trapdoor. "Harold," he said, "I don't think waiting is an option." He hung up before the lawyer could answer. Back at the bottom of the stairs, Caleb stood before the keypad. The numbers were worn but readable. His thumb hovered for a moment, then pressed. 051419171. For 3 seconds, nothing happened. Then something deep inside the wall clunked. Once, twice. The steel door released with a breath of air that had not touched the world in years. Shadow moved closer to Caleb's leg. Caleb gripped the handle and pulled. Beyond the door, darkness waited, and from somewhere inside it, a red emergency light blinked to life. It pulsed once, then and again, washing the concrete walls in a dull red glow. Caleb stood in the threshold with one hand on the steel door, and the other near the flashlight at his side. Shadow pressed close against his left knee, silent now, his nose lifted into the stale air. The place did not smell like a cellar. No mold, no rot, no old rainwater. It smelled dry, sealed, metallic, like machine oil trapped in a toolbox for 50 years, like concrete dust and dead electricity. Caleb moved the flashlight beam across the room. The space opened wider than he expected. Poured concrete walls, reinforced ceiling, steel beams painted government green. A narrow ventilation shaft disappeared into darkness above. Along the left wall stood metal shelving units stacked with olive drab crates, each one stenciled with numbers and faded warnings. On the right, a long desk held radio equipment beneath cracked plastic covers, dials, switches, headsets, a field telephone with a coiled cord, a map board under yellowed glass. This was not a basement. This was a bunker. Caleb stepped inside. His boots made a flat sound against the concrete floor. Shadow entered low and careful, sweeping the room with his nose. He checked the corners first, then the table legs, then the nearest crate. At the far wall, he stopped and stared at a sealed corridor half hidden behind a hanging canvas tarp. "Hold," Caleb whispered. Shadow held. Caleb worked the room in sections. Left corner, clear. Shelves, clear. Desk, clear behind crates, clear. He did not rush. The habit was older than thought. Every object had shape. Every shadow had possibility. His flashlight paused on anything big enough to hide behind, anything reflective, anything out of place. Nothing moved. Only the red emergency light pulsing on the wall. At the center of the desk sat a leather-bound logbook. Dust coated the cover, but someone had placed it neatly, square with the edge, like it was waiting for hands that knew what to do with it. Caleb opened it. The first page crackled softly. Raven Creek Civil Defense Auxiliary Storage Site 7. Below that, in block handwriting, H. Mercer, Engineering Supervisor. Caleb stopped breathing for a moment. H. Mercer, his grandfather. Henry Mercer had been a name more than a person in Caleb's life. A black and white photograph on his father's dresser. A hard-faced man in a work shirt, standing beside a young Ruth Callahan in front of the antique shop when the paint was still fresh. Caleb had been told Henry worked construction after Vietnam, drank too much for a few years, then died before Caleb was born. Nobody had ever said civil defense. Nobody had ever said Site 7. Shadow gave a soft whine near the crates. Caleb forced his eyes back to the logbook. Entries ran through the 1970s in careful lines. Ventilation inspection, water seal holding, radio battery rotation, medical stores transferred, emergency generator tested. Then the handwriting changed in later pages, more uneven. County officials asking questions. Grayson survey crew seen near ridge access. Do not open rear tunnel without 2 men present. Caleb turned another page. A photograph slipped out and landed on the desk. He picked it up. 3 men stood in front of the same steel door. One was Henry Mercer, younger than in the family photo, sleeves rolled up, jaw set. Beside him stood a man Caleb knew from old pictures. Daniel Mercer, Caleb's father, maybe in his 20s. The third man was harder to place. Tall, broad, one hand resting on a survey tripod. On the back in Ruth's handwriting, Henry, Daniel, and Carl Grayson, before the lies. Caleb stared at the name. Grayson. Shadow barked once toward the hanging tarp. The sound cracked through the bunker and came back flat from the concrete. Caleb slid the photograph into his jacket pocket and crossed to the crates. The first one opened with a stiff latch. Inside were vacuum-sealed medical kits, water purification tablets, old field blankets wrapped in plastic. The second crate held radio parts. The third held sealed tins and ration packs, long expired but untouched. Then he found the small black case. It was not military green. It was walnut, polished dark, with brass corners and a small key taped to the bottom. Caleb opened it carefully. Inside were gold coins wrapped in paper sleeves. Not many, enough to be serious. Beside them were U.S. savings bonds, old stock certificates, and a typed note. If the shop is threatened, use these first. Do not sell the land. Ruth again. Caleb sat back on his heels. For 3 days he had been homeless. Under his grandmother's shop was enough to pay taxes, utilities, roof work, maybe more. But the money did not feel like rescue. It felt like bait around a deeper hook. Shadow barked again, sharper this time. Caleb turned. The dog stood before the hanging tarp at the rear wall, body rigid. Behind the canvas, Caleb could now see the outline of another opening. Not a room, a tunnel. He crossed to it, lifted the edge of the tarp, and aimed the flashlight inside. The tunnel sloped downward into the mountain. Narrow concrete walls. Old conduit running along one side. At the mouth of it, deep scratches cut across the floor. Fresh ones. Bright gray against old dust. Someone had been here recently. Caleb crouched and touched the scratches. Dragged metal. Maybe a pry tool. Maybe a crate. Then he saw the footprint, not his. Mud pressed into dust. Yellow-brown clay with pine needles caught in the tread. Same as the alley. Same as Wade's tires. Shadow sniffed the print, then lifted his head toward the tunnel and growled. From upstairs, faint but clear, came the sound of the shop's front bell. Someone had opened the dobra above them. Caleb killed the flashlight. The bunker dropped into red pulses and shadow. Shadow lowered his body without a command. Above, floorboards creaked, one step, then another. Caleb moved to the side of the tunnel entrance, putting the steel shelving between himself and the stairwell. His breathing slowed. His eyes adjusted to the red blink. He could hear the faint scrape of shoes moving through the shop overhead. Not Harold. Too heavy. A voice drifted down through the open trapdoor. Mercer? Wade Grayson. Caleb did not answer. Shadow's lips peeled back without sound. Wade's voice came again. Closer now, colder than before. I know you found it. The words settled into the bunker like dust. Caleb looked toward the logbook on the desk, the photograph in his pocket, the crates, the tunnel, the hidden history breathing around him. Then Shadow suddenly turned away from the stairs and barked hard into the tunnel. Deep inside the mountain, something answered. Not a voice, not a machine. A distant metallic clang echoing from the dark passage behind the bunker. The sound rolled through the tunnel and died somewhere deep in the mountain. Shadow barked once more, sharper this time. Above them, Wade Grayson stopped moving. Caleb heard the floorboards creak overhead, then silence. Wade was listening too. Caleb crouched behind the steel shelving, revolver low against his thigh. The bunker pulsed red every few seconds, turning Shadow's eyes into brief flashes of amber. Then came another sound. Footsteps upstairs, retreating. Wade moved quickly across the shop floor. The front bell rang once. A vehicle door slammed outside, engine, tires on wet pavement gone. Caleb stayed still another 30 seconds before moving. "Stay," he whispered to Shadow. The dog obeyed, though every muscle in him stayed tight. Caleb climbed the stairs fast but controlled, stopping halfway to listen. The shop above sat empty under the weak amber worklight. The front door swayed slightly where Wade had let it close behind him. Cold air drifted through the gap. Caleb checked Pike Street through the window. No Range Rover. Only mist and neon from the tavern sign across the road. But someone else stood there now. The gray-bearded man with the burned hand, watching the shop. The moment Caleb looked directly at him, the man turned away and disappeared inside the hollow lantern. Caleb locked the front door again and dropped the deadbolt. By the time he returned downstairs, Shadow was still facing the tunnel. The dog's growl had gone quieter, focused. Caleb swept the flashlight down the passage again. The tunnel curved slightly after 30 feet, disappearing into darkness. Old conduit pipes lined the wall. Moisture dripped somewhere far back in the mountain. "What the hell were you people hiding down here?" he muttered. The bunker gave no answer. He spent the next hour moving through the room carefully. The desk drawers held civil defense maps, ration inventories, maintenance records, and old photographs of county officials shaking hands beside mining equipment. One locked filing cabinet contained sealed envelopes marked water reports, restricted access. Caleb pocketed those immediately. Another drawer held ammunition. Not much. 2 old boxes of 38 rounds wrapped in wax paper, enough. The farther he searched, the stranger the bunker felt. This was not built for a few weeks of Cold War panic. This place had ventilation systems, reinforced storage, communication equipment wired directly into the mountain. Somebody had invested serious money into hiding it beneath a dying coal town. And Wade Grayson knew it existed. That mattered most. At dawn, Harold Bennett finally arrived. The old lawyer came down the stairs, breathing hard, carrying a flashlight and wearing the expression of a man walking back into a nightmare he had spent years avoiding. When he entered the bunker, he stopped cold. "My God," he whispered. Caleb leaned against the desk, arms folded. "You've been here before." Harold took off his glasses slowly. "Once. In 1987. Shadow watched him carefully, but did not react. Harold looked older in the red emergency light. Smaller somehow. "Ruth made me swear never to come back unless she died." "What is this place?" Harold stared around the bunker before answering. "Officially? A Cold War emergency shelter built with federal money in the 70s. And unofficially," Harold's eyes drifted toward the tunnel, "a storage site. For what?" Harold hesitated too long. Caleb's patience thinned. "For things powerful men didn't want recorded above ground," Harold said finally. That answer sat badly in the room. Caleb stepped closer. "You knew my grandfather built this?" "Yes." "You knew my father was involved?" Harold's jaw tightened. "Yes." "And you knew Wade Grayson wanted this land?" "Yes." Caleb gave one dry laugh with no humor in it. "That's a hell of a lot to leave out over coffee." Harold removed his coat and draped it across a chair. "You were supposed to inherit the building after Ruth passed naturally, sell it quietly, and walk away before anybody realized what was still under here. But Wade already knows." "Yes." "Why?" Harold looked toward the old photographs on the desk. "Because his father helped build it." The bunker seemed colder after that. Harold picked up the picture Caleb had found earlier. Carl Gregson and your grandfather worked together on the federal contracts. Raven Creek was supposed to become a strategic emergency site during the Cold War because of the mountains and the old mine tunnels. What changed? Money. Harold set the photograph down. Things started disappearing. Fuel shipments, equipment, then land deeds, environmental reports. Your father found records proving Carl Grayson had been selling contaminated mining land to the government through shell companies. Caleb stared at him. The water reports. Harold nodded slowly. Your father intended to expose it. The old hunting accident returned to Caleb's mind like a shadow underwater. Wet rocks, rifle discharge. Nobody saw it happen. You think Grayson killed him? Harold met his eyes. I think your grandmother believed it with every bone in her body. Silence settled between them. Then Shadow moved suddenly. The dog crossed the bunker in 3 quick steps and planted himself facing the tunnel again, ears rigid. Caleb turned instantly. What is it? Shadow barked once. Then the tunnel answered. Footsteps. Far away, slow, crunching over gravel deep inside the mountain. Harold's face drained. No, he whispered. Caleb killed the flashlight again. The bunker dropped into pulsing red darkness. The footsteps stopped. Caleb motioned Harold behind the steel shelving. The lawyer obeyed immediately, proving military habits were not exclusive to soldiers. Shadow crouched low. Caleb listened. Nothing. Then came a faint metallic scrape, like someone brushing against concrete. Not imagination, not old pipes. Someone was in the tunnel. Caleb's voice stayed barely above breath. How many exits? Harold swallowed. There's an old mine connection somewhere beyond the secondary chamber. Most of it was sealed decades ago. Most? I said most. Caleb checked the revolver cylinder by touch. 6 rounds. Not enough for fantasies. The footsteps came again. Closer now. Shadow's growl deepened. Caleb moved toward the tunnel entrance slowly, keeping tight to the wall. The old ranger instincts took over cleanly. Breathe low. Reduce silhouette. Listen before moving. Never center yourself in a choke point. The red emergency light pulsed again. For one instant, Caleb saw movement deep in the tunnel. A shadow crossing sideways, then gone. Caleb raised the revolver. Whoever's down there, he called, voice hard and flat. This is your one warning, silence. Then suddenly, a gunshot exploded from the darkness. Concrete burst beside Caleb's head. Shadow hit him full force. The dog slammed into Caleb's chest just as a second round cracked through the tunnel and punched into the steel shelving behind them. Harold shouted something from cover. Caleb hit the floor hard, sliding behind the wall beside the tunnel mouth. Dust rained from the ceiling. Shadow stayed, pressed against him, growling toward the darkness. Contact. The word snapped through Caleb's blood like electricity. Not Montana, not Raven Creek. For one violent second, he was back in Afghanistan again, pinned behind broken mud walls, while rounds cracked overhead and radio static screamed through heat. But this time he did not freeze. Training took over. Caleb grabbed Shadow's harness. Back! The dog retreated 2 steps reluctantly. Another shot rang out. Closer. The muzzle flash lit the tunnel for a fraction of a second. One shooter. Moving backward, Caleb tracked the angle instantly. Not military. Too high. Panicked fire. He leaned out low and fired once. The blast thundered through the bunker. The tunnel went silent. Then came rapid footsteps retreating deeper into the mountain. Running. Shadow surged forward before Caleb could stop him. Shadow. Too late. The German shepherd disappeared into the tunnel darkness after the shooter, and 1 second later, Caleb heard the dog yelp. The sound went through him worse than the gunfire. Shadow. Caleb moved before Harold could grab him. He dropped low and entered the tunnel with the flashlight tight against the revolver, beam cutting through dust and smoke. The concrete walls closed around him. His boots struck gravel. His breathing became small and even. Ahead, something scraped. A man running. Then Shadow whimpered. Caleb rounded the bend and saw him. Shadow lay near a rusted pipe junction, one front leg folded beneath him, fur darkened along the shoulder where a bullet had clipped the muscle. Not deep enough to stop him completely, deep enough to hurt. The dog tried to rise anyway. "Stay down," Caleb whispered. Shadow ignored the first command and dragged himself half a foot toward the darkness. Caleb put one hand on his back. "Down." This time Shadow obeyed, trembling under Caleb's palm. Farther down the passage, metal clanged again. The shooter had fled through an old service hatch, leaving it swinging on one hinge. Caleb saw only the tail end of a boot vanish into a side shaft before darkness swallowed him. He could chase. Every old instinct told him to push forward. Close distance, cut off exit, finish the contact. Then Shadow gave a low breath through his teeth. Caleb looked down. Mission changed. He slid the revolver into his waistband and pulled off his overshirt. His fingers worked quickly, folding cloth, pressing it against the wound, wrapping the shoulder tight enough to slow the bleeding, but not cut circulation. Shadow's eyes stayed fixed on him, bright and alert even through pain. "You're all right," Caleb said. The words came out rough. "You hear me? You're all right." Shadow's tail moved once against the concrete. By the time Caleb carried him back into the bunker, Harold had already opened an old medical kit from one of the crates. His hands were steady now, too steady for a small-town attorney. "Put him on the table," Harold said. Caleb lifted Shadow onto the steel work surface. The dog weighed more than he looked, all muscle and bone and trust. He did not snap when Harold cleaned the wound. He only turned his head and kept his eyes on Caleb. Harold worked with old field competence. "You've done this before," Caleb said. "Vietnam made medics out of people who never asked to be medics. You said different war. I didn't say I was only a lawyer." Harold tied off the bandage and checked Shadow's leg, shoulder, ribs. "Gray's wound, some fragments. He needs a vet, but he'll live if infection doesn't set in." Caleb let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. Shadow lifted his head and nudged Caleb's wrist. For a moment, the bunker was silent, except for the old emergency light ticking faintly inside the wall. Then Caleb turned to the tunnel. Who was he? Harold looked toward the open passage. Could have been one of Wade's men? No. He knew the tunnel. He ran like he had been in there before. Harold did not argue. Caleb stepped to the desk and opened the drawer marked water reports. The files inside were wrapped in plastic. Each folder had a label in Ruth's handwriting. Raven Creek, Chemical Runoff, Grayson Land Holdings, County Water Tests. Daniel Mercer. Caleb stopped at his father's name. The folder felt heavier than paper should. He opened it. Inside were copies of survey maps, handwritten notes, photographs, and a coroner's report. There was also a letter from Daniel Mercer to Ruth Callahan, dated 3 days before his death. "Mom, if anything happens to me, do not let Carl call it an accident." Caleb read the line once, then again. The bunker sharpened around him. The red light, the steel shelves, Shadow's breathing, Harold standing too still beside the desk. Caleb kept reading. Daniel had been working as a field surveyor for Raven Ridge Mining after returning from service. He had found evidence that toxic discharge from illegal chemical storage had been entering the old creek system beneath Raven Creek. The company reports had been falsified. County officials had accepted clean samples from safe wells, while families downhill drank water that carried solvents, heavy metals, and mine runoff. Carl Grayson had signed off on the cover-up, Wade's father, and Daniel Mercer had gathered proof. There were photographs of barrels buried near a sealed mine opening. In one picture, a younger Wade Grayson stood beside his father, smiling in a hunting jacket, one boot propped on a crate marked with industrial warning labels. Caleb's fingers tightened around the photo. Harold spoke quietly. "Daniel came to Ruth first, then to your grandfather. Henry told him to take the files to federal authorities. Daniel wanted one more sample from the lower creek before he left town. He died that day." "Yes, hunting accident. That's what the report said." Caleb laid the coroner's report on the desk. The typed words looked clean, too clean. Accidental discharge, remote terrain, no witnesses. Beneath it, Ruth had attached a second sheet in her own hand. No powder burns on coat. Rifle found 6 feet away. Mud on Daniel's knees. Bruising on right wrist. Sheriff refused second examination. Caleb shut his eyes. Not long. Long enough to keep his hands from shaking. When he opened them, Harold had removed another folder from the cabinet. You need to see this too. The label read, Bennett, JAG Correspondence. Caleb looked up slowly. Harold removed his glasses. I was Army JAG before I came home and practiced estate law. Henry Mercer knew me from Fort Knox. When Daniel died, Ruth asked me to help quietly. We tried to push the records through federal channels. What happened? The files vanished twice. Witnesses changed their statements. The county sheriff retired suddenly with a new house in Florida. Carl Grayson expanded his holdings, and Ruth stopped trusting everyone, including you? Harold nodded, for a while. Caleb looked toward Shadow. The dog had not slept. He watched them from the table, bandaged shoulder rising and falling. She held all this for decades. She held it because she believed someday someone would need to finish it. Why me? Harold looked at him with a tired sadness. Because your father was trying to protect this town. And because Ruth said you were the only one in the family who ever listened before opening a broken thing. Caleb looked back at the files. Water tests, land fraud, buried chemicals, his father's last letter names, dates, signatures. The kind of evidence that did not shout. It waited. Above them, a phone began ringing in the shop, once, twice. Caleb and Harold both looked toward the stairs. The ringing stopped. A minute later, Harold's cell phone buzzed in his coat pocket. He answered without taking his eyes off Caleb. Bennett, his expression changed. What notice? Silence. Then his jaw set. Send me a copy now. He hung up. Caleb already knew it was bad. Harold slipped the phone back into his pocket. The city issued an emergency structural order on the shop. They're claiming immediate public danger. Wade. Yes? How long? Harold's voice dropped. 72 hours before forced closure and demolition review. A dull sound came from the table. Shadow had pushed himself upright despite the wound. His eyes were locked on the stairwell. Caleb reached for the folder with his father's name. Then the water reports. Then the photograph of Wade and Carl Grayson. He stacked them carefully and slid them into an old canvas document bag from the bunker shelf. No hurry now. No panic. Something colder had settled in him. Harold watched him. What are you doing? Caleb looked at Shadows. Leading back up to the antique shop, Ruth had protected until her last breath. I'm done waiting for them to come underground, he said. We bring it into the light. Harold did not argue. By noon, the bunker looked less like a secret and more like a command post. Folders were stacked on the mahogany desk. Photographs were laid in careful rows. Harold used his phone to photograph every page before sealing the originals in plastic sleeves from an old civil defense cabinet. Caleb watched him work, noting how the lawyer's hands moved with the same clean discipline he had seen in old officers filling out casualty forms. Shadow lay on a folded blanket beside the desk. The bandage around his shoulder was spotted red, but his eyes stayed open. Every time Caleb crossed the room, the dog's gaze followed him. When Caleb disappeared up the stairs, Shadow tried to rise until Caleb pointed 2 fingers down. Rest. Shadow lowered himself again, unwilling but obedient. That obedience hurt more than the wound. At 3 in the afternoon, Harold left for the courthouse with copies of the deed, Ruth's will, and enough legal language to slow the demolition order. He promised to send digital copies of the water files to a federal contact outside the county. Caleb did not ask for names. Some things worked better when spoken less. By dusk, rain turned to sleet over Raven Creek. Pike Street emptied early. The tavern lights came on across the road. The gray-bearded man with the burned hand did not appear in the doorway. Wade Grayson's Range Rover did not circle the block. Nothing moved except weather, and the thin red blink from the old neon sign reflected in the wet street. That was what bothered Caleb. Pressure usually made careless men loud. Wade had gone quiet. Caleb sealed the trapdoor and dragged the wardrobe back over it, leaving enough of a gap to open it fast if needed. Then he checked every lock in the shop, front to rear. The back door got a chair braced under the knob. The upstairs apartment got the same sweep. Window latches, stairwell, bathroom, closet. No blind corners left unchecked. Shadow refused to stay downstairs. The dog limped up the steps behind Caleb, one careful paw at a time, teeth clenched around pain in the only way a dog could. Caleb turned at the top and saw him standing there, shoulder bandaged, eyes stubborn. "You're impossible," Caleb whispered. Shadow's tail moved once. Caleb made him a bed near the apartment door, between the bedroom and the stairwell. The dog settled there like he had chosen the best choke point in the building. Outside, wind pressed sleet against the windows. Caleb sat on the edge of Ruth's old bed with the document bag beside him and the revolver on the nightstand. He tried to read the top page of his father's letter again, but the words kept moving. "If anything happens to me, do not let Carl call it an accident." He saw his father in fragments, a hand on his shoulder. A silent drive through Montana. A man cleaning a rifle at the kitchen table, never pointing it toward a door. A voice saying, "You don't get to choose what follows you, son. You just choose what you do when it catches up." Near midnight, Caleb heard a soft thump below. Shadow's head lifted instantly. Caleb was on his feet before the second sound came. Not a knock, not a footstep. Glass breaking. Then the smell hit. Gasoline. Shadow erupted with a growl and launched toward the stairwell. "Shadow, hold." This time the dog did not hold. He barreled down the steps, claws skidding on old wood, shoulder bad and all. Caleb grabbed the revolver, the document bag, and followed. Smoke was already crawling under the front door when he reached the shop floor. Orange light flickered through the display window. Someone had thrown a burning bottle through the glass. Fire climbed the curtain beside the front display, licking fast through dry fabric and old paper. Shelves crackled. A row of antique books began to smoke. The shop that had survived decades, lies, greed, and grief was catching like kindling. Caleb moved on training, not emotion, not yet. He grabbed the small extinguisher from behind the counter, pulled the pin, and swept the base of the flames. White powder blasted across the floor. The fire at the curtain choked down, but another patch flared near the front rug. Liquid had spread under a cabinet. Shadow barked at the rear hallway. Caleb turned. Smoke thickened overhead. The back door was open. Someone had come in while the fire drew him forward. A shape moved near the storage room. Caleb raised the revolver. The figure bolted through the rear exit, knocking the braced chair aside. Caleb took 2 steps after him, then stopped. The ceiling groaned. Heat had reached the old wiring above the front display. A shower of sparks rained down. The brass lantern fixture he had repaired earlier swung once, twice, then dropped, tearing burning wire from the ceiling. The flash of light hit Caleb full in the face. The shop vanished. Mortars over the fob, night torn open, sirens screaming, men running through orange smoke, someone yelling for a medic, the smell of burning plastic and sandbags. Caleb froze mid-step, lungs locked, hands still around the revolver, the fire in front of him becoming another fire from another war. Then Shadow slammed into his leg, not to comfort, to move him. The dog seized the sleeve of Caleb's coat in his teeth and pulled hard, dragging him sideways as a section of burning shelf collapsed exactly where Caleb had been standing. The impact broke the spell. Caleb sucked in smoke and dropped low. "Move!" He grabbed Shadow's harness and pushed toward the rear hallway. The back exit was closer, but flames had crawled along the spilled gasoline near the storage room threshold. Smoke poured low and black now, filling the corridor. A crack split overhead. Part of the ceiling came down. Caleb felt weight hit his back and shoulder, knocking him to one knee. The document bag slid across the floor. Pain flashed white through his leg. He reached for the bag. Shadow got there first. The dog lunged through falling sparks, caught the canvas strap in his teeth, and dragged it toward Caleb. Then a burning board dropped across his hind leg. Shadow yelped. Caleb did not think. He lifted the board with both hands, skin burning through his palms, and kicked it away. Shadow tried to stand, but his back leg folded under him. The bandage on his shoulder had come loose, and fresh blood darkened his fur. "No," Caleb said. It came out like an order to the universe. He slung the document bag over his shoulder, wrapped one arm under Shadow's chest, and lifted. The dog was heavy, too heavy, with Caleb's bad leg screaming under him. But Caleb drove forward anyway. Low, through smoke, past the storage room, out the back door into freezing sleet. Cold air hit them like water. Caleb stumbled into the alley and fell to one knee, still holding Shadow. Behind them, the antique shop glowed orange through broken windows. Across Pike Street, lights came on. Someone shouted. Caleb looked down. Shadow's eyes were open, but his breathing had gone shallow. The nearest emergency vet was not open. Harold had mentioned an old country veterinarian 6 miles outside town, a woman named Dr. Ellen Price, who treated everything from hounds to horses and did not ask foolish questions after midnight. Caleb did not have a car. Harold's Buick was gone. The street was filling with smoke and voices. Caleb wrapped Shadow in Ruth's quilt from the upstairs chair, lifted him against his chest, and started walking. 6 miles. Sleet turned to snow before he reached the edge of town. His left leg threatened to quit after the first mile. By the second, his hands had gone numb around the dog. By the third, he had stopped feeling the burns. Shadow's head rested against Caleb's shoulder. Every few minutes, Caleb felt for breath. Still there, thin but there. The road climbed through dark pines. No cars passed. No porch lights burned. The world narrowed to snow, pain, breath, and the warm weight in his arms. At one point, far behind him, sirens began to wail in Raven Creek. Caleb did not look back. At the 4th mile, he slipped on black ice and went down hard, twisting his bad leg beneath him. Shadow made a small sound. Caleb rolled so the dog stayed above him, protected from the road. For a moment, he lay there staring up at the falling snow. His father's letter pressed against his ribs inside the document bag. Ruth's shop burned behind him. Shadow bled in his arms. Something in Caleb Mercer that had bent for years finally stopped bending. He got to his feet. By the time he reached the weathered sign that read Price Veterinary Service, his breath was ragged and his coat was stiff with ice. He kicked the clinic door with the side of his boot once, twice. A porch light snapped on. An older woman in a robe opened the door with a shotgun held low, saw Caleb, saw the dog, and lowered it immediately. "Table," she said. No questions. Caleb carried Shadow inside and laid him down under the bright white exam light. Dr. Price cut away the bandage, checked the shoulder, then the burned hind leg. Caleb stood beside the table, one hand on Shadow's neck, the other leaving blood and soot on the steel edge. The veterinarian looked up at him. "He saved you, didn't he?" Caleb could not speak. Shadow's eyes found his. Even now, the dog tried to lift his head. Caleb bent close, forehead nearly touching Shadow's. "Not done," he whispered. "You and me. Not done." Outside, sirens echoed faintly from town. Inside, Dr. Price reached for a syringe and began to work. Caleb straightened slowly, soot on his face, smoke in his lungs, Ruth's files still strapped across his chest. "No more hiding," he said, "Doctor." Ellen Price glanced up from Shadow's bandaged leg but did not interrupt. The veterinary clinic smelled like antiseptic, wet fur, and old cedar walls warmed by a struggling furnace. Snow tapped softly against the windows. Somewhere in the back kennels, a hound barked once and fell quiet again. Shadow lay under the exam light, with an ivy line taped to his front leg. Sedation had softened the hard edges of him, but even asleep, his ears twitched at certain sounds. Caleb sat beside the table through the rest of the night, not sleeping, just listening. The old habits returned hardest when rooms became quiet. Every creak of the building became movement. Every passing truck became an engine rolling toward an ambush. At 3:17 a.m., the furnace kicked on with a metallic bang, and Caleb's hand closed around the revolver before he even realized he had moved. Dr. Price noticed from the doorway. "You been home long?" she asked softly. Caleb loosened his grip. "Depends what counts as home." She nodded once like she had heard that answer before. At dawn, Harold Bennett arrived carrying a paper coffee tray and wearing the same suit from yesterday beneath a heavy wool coat dusted white with snow. "You look terrible," Harold said. "So do you." "That's encouraging." Harold handed him coffee, then set a thick folder onto the counter beside the exam room. The county denied the injunction. Caleb took the cup but did not drink. "Wade." "Yes, what now?" Harold opened the folder. "I sent digital copies of the water contamination files, Daniel's letter, and the Grayson contracts to a federal contact in Louisville at 4 this morning. EPA received them an hour later. And the FBI?" Harold's eyes sharpened. "They're interested. Interested isn't enough." "No," Harold agreed. "But it's movement." Caleb looked through the clinic window toward the mountains beyond Raven Creek. Smoke still rose faintly above town where the antique shop had burned. He wondered how much damage remained. He wondered whether the bunker door had survived the fire. Mostly he wondered how long Wade Grayson thought fear would keep working. Shadow stirred on the table. Caleb stood immediately. The German shepherd opened his eyes slowly, confused for half a second before recognizing Caleb beside him. His tail tapped weakly once against the blanket. "Easy," Caleb whispered. Shadow tried to lift himself anyway. Dr. Price stepped in fast. "No hero stuff from either of you today." She checked the bandages again. The shoulders healing clean. Rear leg took the worst of it. No broken bone, but he tore muscle pulling against that falling beam. Caleb looked down at the dog. Shadow met his gaze without blinking, still ready, still waiting for the next command. Something tightened painfully behind Caleb's ribs. By noon, the first news vans rolled into Raven Creek. Harold had leaked enough documents to make the story impossible to bury quietly. Reporters gathered outside the county building. Environmental investigators arrived in marked SUVs. Two men in dark coats spoke with the sheriff near the courthouse steps, while townspeople watched from sidewalks and diner windows. Raven Creek had spent decades learning not to ask questions. Now questions were arriving with cameras. Caleb returned to town alone that afternoon. Shadow stayed behind at the clinic under Dr. Price's orders. The dog watched him leave through the kennel gate, ears low, visibly angry at being left out of the mission. "I'll come back," Caleb said. Shadow pressed his nose against Caleb's hand once. The antique shop stood blackened against the gray sky when Caleb reached Pike Street. Firefighters had stopped the flames before the entire structure collapsed, but the front display was destroyed. Broken glass covered the sidewalk. Smoke stains climbed the brick walls like old bruises. The upstairs windows were shattered. Snow drifted through the ruined front room, but the building still stood, just like Ruth had. Officer trucks and county inspectors crowded the street. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind. Reporters hovered near the tavern across the road, and Wade Grayson was nowhere to be seen. Caleb noticed the gray-bearded man again. Same burned left hand, same careful eyes. This time the man approached first. "You Mercer?" Caleb turned slightly, enough to keep the ruined storefront in view behind him. "Depends who's asking." The man nodded once, almost approving the answer. "Name's Frank Dolan. Used to run blasting crews up at Raven Ridge Mine." He glanced toward the courthouse. "Your daddy was a good man." Caleb stayed silent. Frank rubbed his scarred hand slowly. "Wade's packing up. Heard he's trying to get out before federal boys start digging." "How do you know?" "Because I drove trucks for his father 20 years ago." Frank looked away toward the mountains. "And because guilty men all leave the same way." Caleb watched him carefully. You were in the tunnel. Frank's jaw flexed once. No, you know who was. Frank met his eyes then, long enough for truth to sit between them. Finally, he nodded toward the old mountain bridge north of town. There's only one road out before the state line if Wade's avoiding police checkpoints. Old mining bridge over Blackwater Gorge. Then Frank stepped back. You didn't hear that from me. He disappeared into the crowd before Caleb could ask more. By dusk, Harold called. They issued a warrant for Wade's financial records, the lawyer said, over the phone. EPA confirmed toxic contamination beneath 3 properties tied to Grayson Ridge. Where's Wade? No one knows. Caleb looked north toward the mountains. I do. Snow began falling again as he drove Harold's Buick toward Blackwater Gorge. The road climbed through pine forests and abandoned mining cuts. Fog rolled low between the trees. Caleb killed the headlights half a mile before the bridge and coasted behind an old gravel embankment. No dramatic chase, no revenge fantasy, just observation. The bridge crossed a deep ravine where the river crashed black against rock 80 feet below. 1 lane wide, rusted rails, no alternate route for 20 miles. Caleb parked sideways near the far approach, enough to block the exit without making it obvious from a distance. Then he waited beside the tree line. Collar turned against the cold, revolver hidden beneath his coat. The old ranger in him understood patience better than violence. At 8:42 p.m., headlights appeared through the snow. Black Range Rover, Wade. The SUV slowed as it reached the bridge. Too late. Wade saw the Buick blocking the far end and braked hard. Caleb stepped out from the trees, not rushed, not angry, just there. Wade stared through the windshield. Hands tight on the wheel. For a second, neither man moved. Then Wade stepped out slowly into the snow. You should stayed buried in Montana, Wade. Sib said nothing. Wind pushed snow across the bridge between them. Wade looked smaller out here without offices, lawyers, or county officials around him. Just another aging man in an expensive coat standing over a gorge. You think those files make you a hero? Wade asked. Your father thought the same thing. The words landed flat and deadly. Caleb took one slow step closer. What happened to him? Wade looked toward the river below. My father told him to leave it alone. Daniel wouldn't listen. Wade laughed once under his breath, always trying to save people. Snow collected on his shoulders. He found the runoff site up near Miller's Ridge. One of the chemical tanks cracked during transport. Men got sick trying to seal it. Your father tried pulling workers out before the fumes spread. Wade's eyes shifted back toward Caleb. Carl panicked, thought Daniel would expose everything. Caleb's hands stayed loose at his sides. No shaking, no shouting. Just cold. He didn't die hunting, no. The word hung over the gorge. Wade swallowed once. My father hit him with the truck after they argued. Daniel rolled down the embankment. The rifle story came after. For a moment, all Caleb heard was the river below the bridge. Then tires crunched behind him. 3 black SUVs emerged through the snowfall, with headlights blazing. Federal agents. Wade saw them too late. He backed away instinctively. Don't, Caleb said. Not a threat. A fact. FBI agents spilled from the vehicles, jackets flashing yellow letters through the storm. Commands echoed across the bridge. Wade looked at Caleb one last time. You think this fixes anything? Caleb looked at the snow gathering over the mountains above Raven Creek. No, he said quietly, but it stops you. Agents pulled Wade into cuffs beneath the bridge lights. Storm swallowed the rest. 2 hours later, Caleb returned to Dr. Price's clinic exhausted enough to shake. The waiting room lights were dim. The receptionist looked up from behind the desk. You're the veteran with the shepherd? Yes. Her expression changed slightly. He got out. Caleb froze. What? The kennel latch wasn't secure after medication. We searched the property, but, she swallowed. He's gone. For the first time since Afghanistan, real panic hit Caleb Mercer clean through the chest. He turned and ran into the snow without another word. The storm had thickened over Raven Creek, turning the roads white beneath the clinic lights. Caleb pushed through knee-deep drifts toward the highway shoulder, breath tearing in his lungs. Snow hit his face sideways. His bad leg screamed with every stride, but he barely felt it. Shadow! The name vanished into the wind. He checked the ditch lines first, then the tree line, then the road leading back toward town. No tracks stayed clean for long in the snowfall, but Caleb still dropped to one knee beside every broken patch of snow he found, reading impressions the way he once read disturbed dirt outside compounds in Kandahar. Paw marks, dragging pattern, a stumble near the shoulder, heading south toward Raven Creek. Of course. Caleb stood again, chest tightening. The dog was injured, half sedated, bleeding through fresh stitches, and still trying to get back to the shop. Back to guard the basement. Back to him. The road into town felt longer than before. Snow buried the old mining signs and swallowed the creek below the bridge. Porch lights glowed faint through storm haze. Somewhere in the mountains, thunder rolled beneath the weather like distant artillery. Caleb kept moving. By the time Pike Street appeared through the storm, his coat was crusted white, and his hands had gone numb. The antique shop stood dark against the snowfall. The fire crews were gone. Yellow tape snapped in the wind around the blackened entrance. The upstairs windows were hollow now, empty eye sockets staring down over town. Smoke no longer rose from the roof. For one terrible second, Caleb saw nothing. Then a shape shifted near the front steps. Shadow. The German shepherd lay curled against the ruined doorway beneath falling snow. Body pressed protectively toward the building. One paw rested across the threshold, as if he had dragged himself there to stand guard and simply run out of strength before he could rise again. Jesus. Caleb crossed the street fast, nearly slipping on ice. Shadow lifted his head weakly at the sound of Caleb's boots. His ears twitched once. His tail gave the smallest movement against the snow. Relief hit Caleb so hard it almost folded him. He dropped to both knees beside the dog. "You stubborn idiot," he whispered. Shadow tried to stand. Caleb stopped him gently with both hands. No more hero stuff tonight. The dog leaned heavily into him instead, exhausted at last. Snow settled over Shadow's burned fur and bandaged leg. Caleb brushed it away carefully. His own hand shook now, not from cold, not from adrenaline, but from the slow collapse after both. For years he had carried everything alone. War, funerals, the cabin, the nights waking up with his hand around a weapon before his mind even caught up. Men like Caleb Mercer learned early that breaking happened in private. But there in the snow, beside the burned remains of Ruth's antique shop, with Shadow half frozen against his chest, something inside him finally gave way. He lowered his forehead against the dog's neck and cried. Not loudly, no dramatic collapse, just years of held breath, leaving a tired man all at once. Shadow stayed still beneath his hands, present, warm, alive. After a while, Caleb pulled off his coat and wrapped it around the dog before lifting him carefully into his arms. The old building creaked behind them. Snow drifted through the shattered front windows and settled over ruined shelves, broken clocks and blackened wood. But the structure still stood. Beneath it, the bunker remained sealed below layers of brick, ash, and history. Ruth had protected it. Daniel had died for it. Shadow had bled for it. Now it belonged to Caleb, not as inheritance, as responsibility. Across the street, someone cleared their throat softly. Caleb looked up. Frank Dolan stood beneath the tavern awning, holding a thermos in both scarred hands. He gave a small nod toward the dog. Tough shepherd. Caleb adjusted Shadow's weight in his arms. Yeah. Frank stepped closer through the snow. Town's talking about what you uncovered. EPA boys sealed off Miller's Ridge this afternoon. Folks are finally asking where the sickness came from. Caleb looked back at the shop. They deserved the truth a long time ago. Frank nodded once. Then he handed Caleb the thermos. Coffee, he said. For the walk, no speeches, no apology for old silence, just coffee. Sometimes that was enough. 6 months later, spring came slowly to Raven Creek. The mountains turned green again first. Then the creek thawed. Then the town began changing in small ways nobody trusted at first. Federal cleanup crews remained near the ridge sites. Wade Grayson pleaded guilty to fraud, conspiracy, and environmental violations after evidence from the bunker tied his family directly to decades of illegal dumping and cover-ups. Several county officials resigned before subpoenas reached them. The old antique shop reopened in late April, not exactly as it had been, better. The downstairs became part restoration shop, part museum. Caleb preserved one corner exactly the way Ruth had left it. Her chair by the window, magnifying glass on the table, coffee cup turned upside down. The back rooms held military artifacts, recovered radios, photographs from Raven Creek's forgotten years, and a wall dedicated to local veterans whose names had almost disappeared with the mines. Upstairs, Caleb converted the apartment into temporary housing for homeless veterans passing through eastern Kentucky. Nothing fancy, just clean beds, hot coffee, and doors that locked from the inside. People started calling the place Mercer House before Caleb could stop them. He hated the name at first. Then he stopped correcting people. The bunker stayed hidden. Only Caleb, Harold Bennett, and Dr. Price knew the full truth beneath the shop. The remaining gold and bonds stayed sealed below ground, reserved quietly for repairs, veteran aid, and the future Ruth had protected. Some nights, Caleb still woke before dawn, still listened for mortars that were not coming, still checked windows and doorways before sitting down. Healing did not arrive like movies promised. It came slowly, in pieces. But there were changes. He no longer slept with the revolver under his pillow, and Shadow no longer had to place himself between Caleb and every doorway in the room. The German shepherd healed with a slight limp in his rear leg, though strangers barely noticed it. He spent most days stretched beside the front stove while customers wandered through the shop. Kids from town brought him treats. Old miners scratched behind his ears. Veterans passing through spoke to him before they spoke to anyone else. Shadow accepted all of it calmly. But every night before closing, he still walked the perimeter of the building, once, checking, guarding, remembering. One rainy afternoon near the start of summer, the front bell jingled softly. A young man stood in the doorway wearing a faded Marine Corps jacket and carrying everything he owned in a canvas backpack. Early 20s, hollow eyes. The kind Caleb recognized immediately because he used to see them in mirrors. The young veteran looked around slowly at the restored shop, the polished wood floors, the old photographs, the smell of coffee and cedar. Then he noticed Shadow lying near the stove. The dog lifted his head once. The young man swallowed hard. "You really built this place from nothing?" he asked quietly. Caleb looked across the room toward Shadow. The shepherd's ears twitched at the sound of his voice. Caleb's mouth moved into the smallest smile. "Nah," he said. He nodded toward the dog. "He found it first. And maybe that's the thing about broken souls. Sometimes they don't need to be rescued. Sometimes they just need someone loyal enough to stay." If Shadow touched your heart tonight, drop a simple 1 in the comments. And if you believe veterans deserve a place to come home to, type home below. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us for the next story. Because out there tonight, somewhere in America, another forgotten veteran and another loyal dog are still fighting to find their way back home.